So in addition to actually doing research, I also run a reading clinic at UC Davis. We're called the Reading and Academic Development Center. And we really started the clinical services portion at UC Davis only a couple of years ago. And we actually started it because a parent of a child with autism kept showing up in actually Dr. Emily Solari's office saying, "You guys do wonderful research on reading. When are you going to help my son?" And so we listened and slowly started providing assessment and intervention for children with reading disabilities. Some of our clients have autism, some do not, but we use what we learned through our research and also as educators in order to inform what we do in the clinic. And then that is a reciprocal thing. What we do and learn from children in the clinic often becomes new research questions. So no work in research or in education is done in isolation. We all are a team, and as you can see here, we have a number of faculty, postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, administrative support, and many, many undergraduates actually who work with us in both the research and clinic side. And nothing would be done without our funding agencies, of course. So my talk is going to be kind of in 4 parts. The first part will look at one way of conceiving of reading development, and then within that, what happens when reading doesn't develop in the typical fashion. Then I'm going to talk to you specifically about data from our longitudinal project, looking at reading development in individuals with autism. Then I'm going to look at, or talk to you a little bit about some of our intervention work that we've started to do to address the challenges that we are finding. And then finally talk a little bit about next steps. So I really think about reading as something that starts early in development. The brain starts preparing to read, so to speak, from the time a child is born. We didn't evolve to read, so reading has co-opted different aspects of our language and cognitive abilities, pulled them together in order to do this thing we've invented called reading. So you can think about it broadly as reading is connecting up the visual system with the language system. If you think back to infancy, the visual system, infants can start to parse a visual scene into objects and track them as they move. So you think of the very first thing an infant might see, the mother's face, and then as vision develops more, they start to see things further away from them. But that very first part of the visual system is just tracking important things in the environment. In the language system, as infants become exposed to language, they're amazing in how they can start to parse apart the stream of speech that's coming at them. And they very quickly become very attuned to the sounds of the languages that they're hearing, and they start actually not perceiving the sounds that they're not exposed to. So all infants are born with the capability to hear all sounds in different languages, but they very quickly become specialists. By the time a child is 2, babies can recognize a more stripped-down version of objects. In other words, they're starting to be able to represent or to see symbols and to take a line drawing of something and now understand that that represents the real object. And that's an important part of getting the reading brain going. Their vocabulary is growing 10 to 20 words every day by the end of the 2nd year. And by the time they're entering kindergarten, all the key visual recognition processes are in place, but they're still maximally plastic. In other words, they're still really open to input. So it's a time that's ripe for learning. It's not an accident that that's when they're going to kindergarten, right? And then they also have become real experts in the phonology and basic grammar rules, and they have a vocabulary of anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 words, optimally. So they're coming into kindergarten with these 2 systems really revved up and ready to go, ready to become exposed to text. Now, there are other things, of course, that play into this with other processes of self-regulation, attention, memory. All these other processes are underlying this, but I want you to think particularly about these two systems, and also think about specialists in your school system who might be working, specifically with these. I'm thinking speech and language pathologists in your schools and things like that as being key players in understanding reading development. So reading is not simple. It's actually one of the most complex things that we do, and we try to teach children at a very young age how to do. It really uses not just those two systems, but the entire brain to collaborate and work together, all the different systems, to really understand what you're reading. But if we think about the simple view that a couple of researchers came up with back in the 80s, they're talking about two main processes. The blue leg is the decoding leg. In other words, you've got to be able to look at the text on the page and make sense of it. So you have to know, what the letters are, what the sounds are that are attached to each of those letters. You have to understand the alphabetic principle, and you have to be able to really hear the sounds in speech. So it's called phonemic awareness. You have to be able to not only see the letters and know that they make certain sounds, but if you're hearing a word, you have to be able to hear all the separate sounds. So we talk about segmenting words. If you think of the word cat, k, at, you have to actually hear those three separate sounds, then attach those to symbols. Okay, so that's one part of reading. It's a critical part, but it's certainly not sufficient to make meaning, right? So the other part is the language comprehension part, and that requires things like all your, like we were saying, all your oral language development, your understanding of syntax. That's the order of the sentences in words. If you put the words in a different order, the sentence means something very different. The semantics, that's your vocabulary. And then there's a higher order processes. Can you take what you know about the world, so your background knowledge, and can you integrate that with what you're reading right there in the text to make inferences about what's going to happen, and to make deeper meaning and recall it, and store that in a way that you can recall later. So this is one kind of visual representation of that. Excuse me. I like this one as well. This is kind of flipping that A on its side. So now we have all the word recognition processes. So you have to have that phonological awareness. You have to be able to decode. That's your phonics system. Spelling is really the reverse. And then sight word recognition. So these are all different aspects of teaching the child to access the print on the page. They need an explicit instruction in phonological awareness so that they can decode and encode, as well as the memorization of sight words. And this is something that those of you who've been in the classroom for a long time know that we ebb and flow in terms of the type of early reading instruction we give children. When I was getting my credential in 1991, 92, it was all about whole language. So we were told, don't bother teaching phonics. That's not important. They will intuit that. And we know now that that's not the best approach. In fact, we see a lot of kids in the clinic that still go to school in districts where it's phonics instruction is not explicit for everyone. But we do know something from whole language, and that is, of course, it's important to expose children to good literature. Of course, it's important to read to them and help them understand how books and literature relate to their life and allow them access to other worlds and other places. And the kinds of activities that build background knowledge and that to teach kids to connect that background knowledge to what they're reading, or to read something and then extend it out into the world and acquire new background knowledge. You need explicit instruction of vocabulary, language structures. Again, that says syntax and grammar. You need to be able to really understand how to make inferences, something that's very difficult to do. and then other just general literacy knowledge. So all of these factors are coming together as the children start learning more and more about how to read. And as you can see just from this one list, I mean, we're asking children to do a lot as we're teaching them how to read. And over time, all of this needs to become increasingly fluent and automatic so that you have all the resources, all the cognitive resources available to actually make sense and learn from what you're reading. So in the first couple years of school, we're teaching them to be really fluent in what they're reading so that as they go on throughout life, really, they read for information. There are other things that also influence comprehension. There's motivation. So are you interested in reading? Do you have a particular goal for this reading assignment? What is your own, as a reader, what is your own standard of coherence for yourself? In other words, what is your own standard of comprehension for that? You know, you all in the room read a lot, and you read for different reasons, and for each of those different reasons, you might have a different level of understanding that you're willing to tolerate. So if you're reading and you know you're going to have a test, you have a very different level or standard for yourself than if you're just reading on the beach. The other thing that's really important to understand about reading is that it's actually communication. You know, we've talked a lot this morning about communication, and reading is just written communication between an author and a reader. So the author had a purpose for writing that particular thing as well. And do you as a reader understand that, you know? And of course, texts have different levels of difficulty, and we have all different genres. And the amount of reading that we do influences how good a reader we are, right? So it's like anything, the more you do it, the better you become. And then the final piece that's really related to this idea of understanding that reading is just a written form of a conversation between two people is that there's this thing called theory of mind, social cognition. In other words, do you understand that the characters, if you're reading a story, that all those characters might have different perspectives from one another? And can you make predictions about what they might be doing or what they're thinking or what's motivating them? Can you understand that this is something that is important to the core of a story? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So then, if we're thinking about the simple view of reading and we're thinking about there's this whole piece about decoding the words on the page, and then there's this other piece that talks about higher level language comprehension. You can have difficulty with one or the other or both of those aspects of reading. So if you have trouble really accessing or cracking the code of reading, in other words, if you have trouble with the phonological processing, you have trouble pulling apart the sounds in a word or putting them back together or even hearing the separate sounds in words, then you have something that we would call dyslexia, right? And that is really just, dyslexia just means difficulty with words. So I know it sometimes becomes sort of a politically charged label, but it really at its core just means you're having difficulty reading the words. Then we have a subgroup of kids who actually read the words just fine. They can read out loud very fluently, but their comprehension is much far below what you would think based on the fluency. And so both of those subgroups we see somewhere between 7 to 10% of the school population having difficulty either with the actual code, so they're having difficulty with a dyslexic type profile, or as a poor comprehender. Now, of course, if you have trouble with your fluency, your comprehension will also be impacted. But there are children who, sometimes it's referred to as a late emerging disability. They really just are having trouble with the comprehension, and it's more rooted in their language development or higher level language development than in the code cracking part. Okay, so with that basic Reading 101 in place, let's think about reading in children with autism. First of all, I just wanted to frame autism as part of sort of the human diversity perspective. So we think about autism in the Rad Center as part of human nature, and the characteristics that are associated with it are observed on the continuum in everyone in the population. So we just think about sort of celebrating the diversity of development. And they're children first. The children affected by autism are more similar than different from their peers. And that is true as well when we look at something like reading. So just a quick refresher. I know you're all familiar with this, but if you think about the current definition of autism as being comprised of two core features. There are social and communication or interaction difficulties, and then there are restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. And both of those actually play into some of the challenges in reading that we see in our students with autism. The other thing to think about is expressive language and receptive language level is no longer a part of the actual core definition of autism, but it's something that's extremely crucial to consider, obviously, for clinicians, teachers, researchers. And I would say also the cognitive level, cognitive development is equally important to consider as we think about instruction. And 68 to 69% currently, with the latest stats that I've seen, have cognitive development that is considered within the average range of development. And so these children are, a number of them are being served in the general education classrooms, and we're going to look at a sample of children who fall into this range here in a moment. So what we do know is that while 68% or so of children with autism do not really have cognitive impairment, we do see that they have a lot of difficulty with accessing written material. So some of the research has shown that samples, like 33 to 65% of their samples have challenges with reading comprehension. Okay, that is a very broad range, and that is partly due to the fact that the research, sometimes the samples have higher or lower development in cognition and language, and then of course there's assessment. Assessment is always tricky. Those of you that work in assessment know that assessments can tell us a little bit about a child, but that any one assessment by itself doesn't give us the full picture. But we have established in research, and I'm sure you could tell us as well, that this is a challenge. We also see that a lot of times in our kids with autism, these challenges are not really seen until the children enter 4th grade and above. So in other words, K through 3, a lot of the children with autism appear to be developing their reading along with the peers. So cracking the code, learning the rules of reading and phonics. But that after 4th grade, we start seeing more differences. So what is contributing to this? Well, one thing to think about is the children affected by ASD are definitely at risk for oral language difficulties. And this has been shown to play a significant role in reading comprehension. And so a lot of children with ASD are probably seen at your school sites by the speech and language pathologist at least sometime during the week. And one thing I've come to know after working with hundreds of different children of different ages with autism is that sometimes just having a conversation with them does not highlight the actual language challenges that they experience. So whether it's them understanding you or them actually conveying the kinds of things that they are really intending to convey, sometimes I'm not saying this very well, but sometimes they come across in a way that they seem more proficient than they actually are. So we talk about language as having a couple different components, and one component we call the structural language skills. So that would be syntax, grammar, vocabulary, morphology, those aspects of language. And what we find is that in a lot of studies with kids with autism, their reading comprehension aligns with these structural language skills. So when we're thinking about a child with autism who's having difficulty understanding what they read, we need to think about things like the vocabulary development, morphology development, and syntax and grammar. But we also need to think about some higher order skills, and I'll go into that more in a moment. So there's a little body of research that's emerging that's really looking, though, at actual autism symptom severity and the severity of their social and communication challenges. And we see that there's a real relationship between the severity of the autism symptoms and their reading comprehension challenges. One aspect of social communication is the social cognition, or theory of mind. So social cognition refers to how people process, store, and apply information about other people and social situations. It focuses on the role that cognitive processes play in social interactions. So, and it is a developmental thing for all children that they, over time, children acquire more and more of an understanding that other people might experience things in a very different way than they do and have their own thoughts and their own feelings about a situation. So there's actually quite a large body of research in autism looking at the development of theory of mind or social cognition. And most of the researchers look at it more broadly. So they're looking more at just the actual development and how to measure theory of mind. We're interested not only in how to measure it, but how does it relate to children's reading comprehension. And one thing we do know about theory of mind from all the great research that's been done in is that, again, this goes back to children's language ability. So that's a theme that you're going to hear throughout the talk today, is that a lot of this connects back to children's language development. So I work with Dr. Peter Mundy at UC Davis, and a few years ago now, well, more than a few, about 6 years ago now, he got a large grant from the Federal Department of Education to do a longitudinal study to examine reading development in children with autism. And he had several main goals. The first was to better understand the role of decoding and linguistic comprehension, so that simple view of reading, with a large sample size and more comprehensive reading battery. And one thing a caveat I have to describe about autism research is a large sample size is more than, say, 60. So in a lot of research, and if people here are in policy work, of course you're thinking thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals, but when you're really doing in-depth research, we got 80 children in our sample, and that's considered a large sample. We also wanted to understand the role of autism symptom severity and social cognition in predicting their reading comprehension. So we were trying to pick apart, are the reading challenges that children are experiencing the same as all children's reading disability issues, or is there something really specific to kids with autism that we need to address? So can we just use any reading intervention with these children, or do we need to tailor it somehow? And then we had a couple different comparison samples in our study. We had as somebody said earlier, I'm not quite sure what typically developing is because we've never met the typical child. But so our typically developing sample, let's just say they didn't have autism or ADHD and they were in the general education classroom. And then we actually did have an ADHD sample because we were trying to understand if the differences in reading for children with autism was the same or different from another clinical group like ADHD, because children with ADHD and children with autism share some of the same attentional problems sometimes. So those of you that work with the kids know, or a lot of times actually the ADHD and ASD are comorbid. So we'll see both labels attached to a child, right? So we recruited all these children. When we first met them, they were anywhere between the ages of 7 and 16. There was those 3 groups. Group with ASD, there were 80 children in that group. The ADHD control sample, there were about 40 children in that group. And the typically developing children, there were 40 in that group. And we followed them out for 3 years. We assessed them at 15-month intervals, and we chose 15 months because we didn't want to see the same children at the same time point in their school year every time. So in other words, we didn't want to have a whole group that we tracked for 3 years and only saw them in the fall after they'd been off for the whole summer, etc. So we picked 15 months to try to see them at different points in their school year. So this just shows you a little bit more about our sample. I'm going to really be focusing on the ASD sample today. So let me just describe them a little bit. They were considered a high-functioning sample. They all had a community diagnosis of autism, but then when they came into the study, we did an ADOS on every child to confirm diagnosis. Is everyone familiar with the ADOS? I'm seeing some heads nod. Okay. That's important because actually, not only did we do it to confirm diagnosis, but we used the data from the ADOS in some of our analyses. 93% had an IEP, or 504, but it was almost all IEPs. And 80% actually spent the majority of their school day in inclusive gen ed settings. So that's actually, Kristen Wright's presentation this morning was really interesting to see that that's not necessarily the norm, but for our students in the study, it was the norm. So only 11% were in a special day class. And I want you to keep that in mind as we look at the data, because these kids are in a gen ed setting. Some had aids, but not all. And when you see the reading data, I think you'll be interested. The other great thing about this study is that we got to put in a lot of reading and language measures so that we were really able to try to get past some of the measurement issues where you're tied to just 1 or 2 assessments. We tried to have a comprehensive battery. So it would take a couple slides to list them all by name, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to talk to you later. I love talking measurement. So we had a big battery of language reading measures. We measured phonological processing, oral language, vocab, word reading and decoding, oral text reading fluency, reading comprehension, narrative retelling, inference, and so on. So lots of things. Then, as I mentioned, we did the ADOS. And if anyone in the room hasn't heard of the ADOS, I want to just make sure you understand. So it's a semi-structured assessment of communication, social interaction, and play, depending on the age. There are 4 different modules. Our children were all high-functioning and verbal, so they all had a module 3 or 4. So you set up, it's about a 45-minute assessment. It's a very structured assessment where you're pulling for behaviors that indicate levels of social communication and also restricted interests or repetitive behaviors. Then we had a couple of social cognitive measures or theory of mind measures. One that's been used a lot in the literature is called strange stories. And that's where we would put it was on a computer screen. It was a short paragraph, it was a little story basically. And then there would be a question after the story. And the question always related to the state of mind or the intentions of a character in this little story. And to make sure that we wanted to account for differences if children couldn't read yet, so it was read aloud to them. And then because we know that kids with autism often struggle with their oral language and understanding, we wanted to have a less verbal task. And so there were a couple of researchers at Cambridge came up with this task called the silent films task. And so we tried it was similar to Happy's Strange Stories, where they saw a little vignette, but this time it was a little black and white film clip of something happening. And then a question asked about the characters in the film clip. So that's the silent films task. So what did we find in the study? Well, first let's just look quickly at skills over time. So this was vocabulary. The red line is the ASD sample, and the blue line is the typically developing sample. And what you can see is that they not only never caught up with the typically developing sample, but they actually just sort of plateaued, whereas their typically developing peers continued to make gains. But this is, to me, the more interesting slide. This is their reading comprehension. And we measured the reading comprehension. This data, we measured it in a couple ways, but this data is showing the gray oral reading test. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. We use the 5th edition. So the gray oral reading test requires children to read passages out loud, and you actually get a rate, accuracy, and fluency score. And then you remove the text from view, and then you ask them 5 open-ended questions about the text. And some of the open-ended questions are more, pulling for recall of details, and other questions require inference or predictions, things like that, main idea. So there's a variety of questions in there. The average score on this is a standardized score, so the average score should be 10. And what we see is, at time point 1, they're averaging about 7.8, so they're well below the average, whereas their typically developing peers are right at average, which is what we'd expect. And that they don't make any gains over time. So they do grow, but they never catch up to their typically developing peers. Again, these kids are all in the general education classroom and all have cognitive abilities and language abilities that place them more or less in the average range, but they are really struggling on this measure. So one of the things we know about reading is that it's really important to understand all the elements of the narrative, right? It's important to not only be able to talk about the characters and the setting and the plot, but to really be able to retell a coherent story to somebody. And so we had a standardized measure of narrative retelling. And this is longitudinal data. I'm sorry, it's kind of messy, but what you can see is that the children with ASD did improve in their narrative retelling skills over time. But what's not on the slide is they were far below the typically developing kids. And we found that there was a really significant relationship between having lower ASD symptom severity and doing better on this measure. So in other words, the kids who had fewer restricted interests and who had better social communication skills, not surprisingly, were doing better on this assessment. And also the children with the higher language scores. So this is where people like your speech and language pathologist and school psychologist can be really helpful, because it allows you to understand more about the child and to see that even early on, the better oral language and social communication skills that they have, the better they are at these tasks as they get older too. So there was a significant relationship between the first time we met them and those language scores and their narrative scores, and then the last time we saw them with their reading comprehension scores. There was this trajectory that the kids that had better language and lower social communication symptom severity scores, their reading comp by the time they finished up with us as teenagers was much higher. Is that making sense? So we're thinking about, again, that early is great, but of course it's never too late. But early language intervention as well as reading. So again, we're talking, kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. Then a topic that's near and dear to my heart is really trying to understand inferencing ability. So the ability to integrate what you know about the world with a text in order to make more deeper meaning out of that text, or to make predictions about that text. So it's something that you all do probably without even thinking about it, but it's something that was really difficult for a lot of our kids. And so what we saw, the red boxes are time points 1, 2, and 3, and this data is a little messier than the other graph because it's not as cleaned up. But what we saw, unfortunately over time, was that they actually didn't grow. These are raw scores. So they were not improving. So not only were they not growing over time, but their peers were taking off. And so this is a particularly important area for them in terms of thinking about intervening. And again, it comes back to the children who the first time we met them had better oral language skills. They were the ones that were doing better with inference ability across the study. So it's like that initial time point, the language ability was so important that it carried and predicted growth in a lot of different aspects of reading across the entire longitudinal study. So again, implications, thinking about early oral language development. So one thing we do know, though, is that no two children are alike. So there is a lot of variability in all children, including children who have a designation as having autism. So we used a statistical method where we were able to look for subgroups. And the great thing about it is not only were we just having to create subgroups maybe on one measure, but we were able to statistically use all of the language and reading measures to look at subgroups based on all of these different skills. So what did we find? Well, let's spend a little bit of time on this slide because there's a lot going on. But I think it's important, and this is information I'd really like to share with you and love any feedback on as well. And this was published in a paper this last year, if anyone's interested in reading the paper. But we put in things like phonological processing, so rapid naming, non-word repetition, and elision. So we looked at their phonological memory, the speed at which they were able to process symbols, and their phonological awareness. So we know that that's important to learn how to decode words, right? Then we looked at word and text recognition, so non-word decoding efficiency, sight word reading efficiency, and then text level reading accuracy. So we wanted to have a lot of different measures. One thing we found, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is sometimes assessments at the word level in kids with autism don't tell the whole picture. So for instance, a single word vocabulary test might not tell the whole picture about their level of understanding of words or of sentences. And then the same thing with their ability to read sight words. It doesn't tell you the whole picture about text level reading and fluency. And then in this quadrant, we have linguistic comprehension. So we put in self-recalling sentences, which is just the ability to repeat back sentences. Anybody administered? I'm sure you've administered things like this. And even in this high-functioning sample, the majority of kids in the sample had difficulty with this assessment. And this assessment really taps into their syntactic and semantic development. So you have to be able to use your knowledge about word order and meaning in order to remember these longer and longer, more complex sentences. And this, in the literature, the research and clinical literature is a marker for structural language impairment. Then we measured vocabulary, auditory reasoning, which is the inference measure, and then narrative retelling. And then finally, reading comprehension. So we found that in our sample of high-functioning kids, that there were actually 4 subgroups that, and we just replicated this. This was at the first time we met the children, and we just replicated this looking at data from the last time we saw them, that the subgroups remained the same, although a few of the children changed groups. But the groups were about a third of the kids were what we consider average readers. So that's great news. So for the kids who have, who are considered higher functioning, that are in general education classrooms, about a third of them, according to our measures, were doing well. They were average readers. But then there were 3 groups where they were having challenges, and they were having different challenges. So there was one group in the literature, there's been a lot of talk about kids who have great reading fluency, or at least single word reading and decoding, but have poor comprehension. And we did find that subgroup, but it was not the majority of the children by any means. It was about 21% of the sample. So they had good phonological processing, good word and text recognition, but poor linguistic comprehension and poor reading comprehension. So they did not have dyslexia, but they were really struggling to understand what they were reading. And then we had two other subgroups who were having difficulty across the board. So we had a global disturbance group and a severe global disturbance group, which accounted for about just under 50% of the sample. And again, remember, these are high-functioning kids in general education classrooms. About 50% of them were having difficulty across the board with all the reading measures. We were surprised. I thought that because we had a higher functioning sample where I assessed most of these children, not at all 3 time points, but for the first 2 time points, and until I really started working with them on all the assessments, I thought that they would have done much better just from initial chatting and getting to know them. So we were surprised. This is another way to look at it. So a third average readers, 21% comprehension only problems, 33% global difficulties, so about 1 standard deviation below average on everything, and then severe global difficulties, 14%, where they were anywhere from 1.5 to 2 standard deviations below average. So really, really not accessing anything written. And the other thing we found, remember I was talking about, you can see the ADOS scores cropping up again later. We found that the autism symptom severity, so the higher their ADOS scores, which means they're showing more characteristics of autism, the more difficulties they were having. So the average readers were significantly lower in symptom severity than the severe global and the reading comp, the linguistic comp only kids. So it's just something to think about. There is a definite relationship between the social communication issues and actually also specifically the restricted interests that's impacting comprehension. And this is not on the slide, but I love data, so I was playing around with it and really trying to understand, was it the social communication aspect of the ADOS that was relating to the difficulties, or was it that restricted interest and repetitive behaviors aspect? And it was really both. It wasn't just social communication. And what do you guys think? Like, why do you think that restricted interests and repetitive behaviors might be impacting comprehension? Yeah, that's what I think too, limited background knowledge, right? So they're really in-depth knowledge about specific things, but a general bank or store of knowledge about the world, about people, and social interactions is much more limited. And especially through elementary school, a lot of what you're reading with them is fiction, where the characters, whether they're animals or humans or objects or whatever, you need to have social knowledge in order to access those stories. I guess I mentioned I love data, and I love statistical methods that allow us to probe the data and ask different kinds of questions. And so I'm not going to get into any of the stats, but if anyone's interested, I'd love to chat with you about it. But I'm just going to show you what it means in terms of what we found. This was actually my dissertation a few years ago, and I wanted to really understand the relationship between the different aspects of reading and their ASD symptomatology. Because again, like I said, my goal in the end is to figure out what is it that we can do to really help the kids. What kinds of interventions do we need to design? Do we need to just take regular interventions but add a component to it? There are all these different kinds of questions. So you start out with measuring reading comprehension. We use those 2 measures. We use the GORT, and then we also use the QRI. Is anyone familiar with the QRI? So qualitative reading inventory. So it gives a different kind of reading comprehension measurement that we felt was sort of compatible with the GORT. Then we looked at measuring structural language and higher order language, word reading and decoding, because that's the simple model, right? But I also wanted to know, well, how do those things relate to each other? Because we know kids with autism have language development issues, and we know that language development impacts your ability to read and decode. So we need to understand the relationships with one another there. And then, how is there something specific to autism relating to all of this? Or is it? And is it relating to their language development and their word reading and decoding? So the great thing about structural equation modeling is that you can look at all of these things simultaneously. You put in all the different assessments that you have done with a child, and then you can look at this. We also wanted to look at text reading fluency, because we know, those of you that work in reading, that single word reading is important to understand, but it's not the whole picture. We want to know what it looks like at the text level. So we thought that might be important. And what did we find? Well, we found that once we put everything into this model, that something specific about ASD no longer uniquely predicted reading comprehension. So we thought, okay. We also found that structural language, remember that was the vocabulary and syntax and grammar, was not a unique predictor of reading comprehension. We also found, interestingly, that word reading and decoding, while we know it's necessary for reading, it wasn't a strong predictor of reading comprehension in the sample. So what was important? Well, what we found out, let's start over here on the left, it was very important to consider whether they had ASD and how severe the symptoms were, but it was important because it helped us understand their language development. So the kids with more symptomatology had worse language development. Also, surprisingly, the kids with more severe ASD symptoms had more difficulty with decoding and word reading and fluency. Why do you think that would be? Anyone have any thoughts? We have a few hypotheses, but we don't know for sure either. What do you guys think? Yeah. The idea of equivalence, or like representation. Yeah, that's a great idea. What other things could be going on? I'm sure there's a variety of things. Great, yeah, attention to relevant details, what's important, what's not important. Excellent. Yes? Yeah. Exactly, yeah, phonics is, in English, English is not a transparent orthography, as they say. It is not without its challenges in memorizing all those different rules. In the clinic, we definitely see a lot of kids with autism who also have dyslexia. So if you'll notice, the only arrows that are really left pointing at reading comprehension is this higher order language variable. And that was inference, narrative retelling, and a measure of being able to kind of process a sentence at the gist level. So like being able to paraphrase. More severe the kids' symptomatology was, the more difficulty they were having with inference and narrative retelling, and thus more difficulty with comprehension. So it really helps us start to think about targets for intervention, right? So language, structural language is important still, because as you can see, these little curved lines without arrows are correlations. So their structural language ability was very significantly related to their higher language, like 0.9, which is a very high correlation. It was also very significantly related to their word reading and decoding. So back to language. And then word reading and decoding wasn't predictive by itself, but it definitely predicted their fluency, which was then important. So those were two really key things, higher order language and text level fluency. And why do you think there'd be a big difference between word level fluency and text level fluency in terms of how important they are? What do you guys think? Why is it important to measure text level? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We're kind of back to that context piece. Yeah, because one thing that facilitates your text level oral reading is having an understanding of not only, you come across a homophone or something in a sentence, and you need to be able to understand what's going on in order to read those words. And then there are other things that play into it, of course, like processing speed and things like that. But the word level assessments can't get at that, and it's really important. I do just want to say those 2 theory of mind measures that we looked at, the strange stories and the silent films task, were significant predictors of reading comp, even after you controlled for their language ability, their nonverbal cognitive ability, their fluency, everything else. Those social cognitive measures were still important. So that gets us back to, yes, there is something specific to autism that we need to consider when we think about reading intervention. Let's talk about what fun things we're doing now. Remember this model? So we have a program that Dr. Emily Solari helped write when she was in Houston, and it's called Eager Beavers. And it's a strategic comprehension intervention, and it actually is a listening comprehension and vocabulary intervention. It targets comprehension, it targets oral language development, higher order language development, and text level fluency. And we think maybe by targeting reading comprehension, because things like the social communication, social cognitive aspects of reading are emphasized in this curriculum, we think maybe there's a bidirectional relationship between intervening with reading comprehension and possibly helping move the needle on ASD symptomatology. So the intervention has 3 pieces. We use like good quality children's books. So there are things like, let's see, The Kissing Hand, Max and Ruby, gosh, I'm blanking out, Sandwich Swap, I don't know if you guys know that one. Stand Tall, Molly Lou Mellon. There's mostly fiction, but there are some nonfiction books. Anyway, the important thing about this is that they are great books. They do have a lot of pictures. And there's a manual, so it's a scripted direct instruction curriculum where there's a scope and sequence of comprehension skills taught. There's before and after guiding questions, so there's a guiding question posed before the reading, and then it's reviewed at the end. They're within text stickers that allow the teachers to provide targeted questions throughout the reading. Then there's vocabulary instruction that's embedded both within the reading, so they first encounter the vocabulary words for the day in the actual context of the story, and then after the reading for that day, there's more explicit instruction with different activities. And then each day there's a little bit of writing, and it's kind of the writing process. So it goes from idea generation to list making to writing sentences to writing paragraphs. And it's really to practice the comprehension skill. So there are lots of different ways to think about developing comprehension. A lot of different curricula out there have the child use a lot of different skills all in one day. You might read a text and then do a little bit about the plot and then talk about predicting things or main idea, all in one day. And the idea behind this curriculum is that you spend weeks on one skill with a couple books. So each book is read 5 times with different guiding questions that allow the child to begin to learn each skill. And as Dr. Solari will say, it's hard to lay out a definite scope and sequence of comprehension skills because really, when you're a good reader, you bring all to bear at once. But when you're trying to teach it, you have to start somewhere. So we do start with one that seems obvious, which is direct recall. So can you just remember what's directly stated in the text? That is a good starting place. From there, we talk about making connections to our background knowledge, so helping kids understand what they already know and how that might help them understand the story better. This is actually a skill that is really, really hard for many of our kids on the autism spectrum. I don't know if that's surprising to anyone. But, no? Narrative story elements and retelling. Then we talk about making inferences, because making inferences we teach as really a combination of direct recall and background knowledge. Then we talk about the main idea, asking good questions, summarizing and paraphrasing, and monitoring meaning. So this whole scope and sequence actually takes about 30 weeks to get through the entire curriculum. So that was actually written for children who are English language learners. And we thought, gosh, you know, this curriculum targets a lot of the things that we saw as needing targeted intervention in our kids with autism. Let's test it just the way it was written and see what kinds of adaptations we might need to make. So we also use hand signals to reinforce comprehension skills. So we teach them a gesture. So we talk about, for direct recall, well, I heard it right in the book. That's how I know it. You know, you might make, this reminds me of something in my background knowledge, and so on. So I wasn't sure if that would be something that our kids would really take to, but in general, they actually did like the gestures. We use a vocabulary log. We do a lot of trying to facilitate social interactions between the children in these small groups that we're working with. They make their own rules. And we use things like visual schedules, and we call them daily agendas, so that they could monitor their progress, and it provided structure and predictability for the groups. So we've done several pilots to try this out with different kinds of kids and different teaching models to see what kinds of adaptations we should make. So as I mentioned, the instruction is direct and explicit. And we initially started with an undergraduate as a teacher and another undergraduate as behavior support and 2 children in the group. So it was an unrealistic model for schools, but we wanted to try it out, sort of, you know, best possible scenario. And we started off in a lab setting, and we actually moved it into the school last year. Next step will be to actually implement with school folks. So really, the kids that we've been working with so far are not the same as a longitudinal sample. I want to reinforce this, that the kids that we've actually piloted the intervention on are more in the moderate cognitive impairment area. So they have oral language, but they aren't really high on their oral language skills. We wanted to see, does this intervention work in kids who were, say, in an SDC class at school? The one thing we're really struggling with is looking for assessments that are really sensitive to change in these kids in the intervention. So love to chat with people about what they're finding. We did find that narrative generation tasks have shown growth even in 8 weeks, even in low verbal kids. So that's really exciting. We do know that that's one sensitive measure. And we know from those earlier models that I showed you that narrative retelling is an important part of reading comprehension and a particular deficit for these kids. So if you're interested in that, I can talk to you more about that. You can see there's a lot of growth pre-post in their narrative evaluations. So last year we did implement year-long in an SDC, or 3 SDC classrooms in a district, public district, and we're still parsing through all that data, but we found that the narrative generation task was also showing a lot of growth with those kids, and that they're getting more into the social cognitive aspects of the characters and doing more evaluation of emotional states and using language that shows that they understand when they're telling somebody a narrative that person is listening and might have a different idea about what's going on. So they're showing growth in social cognition, which is really exciting. And then basically we saw growth in more proximal measures of language and reading. So things that were really closely related to the intervention. The next step is to really look at how can we show growth on more distal things, or are they generalizing to other things? That's the next step. And as many of you know that work with these kids, sort of impediments to accessing the curriculum are things like attention regulation, anxiety, language levels for some of the kids. So we're working more on using evidence-based practices to help with all of those aspects.